There are some key players rising up the fantasy football rankings as we approach the second half of the season. And this is important because these are the exact guys who become league winners for you. So here are those players that are skyrocketing up the rankings, not just for this week, but the rest of the year. And we could begin with the Packers running back Aaron Jones, who finally got his full-time role in week 9, and he produced. Because Jones saw a massive, by his standards, a very massive 24 opportunities for over 100 total yards, and he puts up about 19 fantasy points. Look, head coach Matt LaFleur before this game said, yeah, we're going to cut loose of Aaron Jones, and he wasn't lying. That's what he did. So now Aaron Jones has played in 2 fully healthy games this season, and here's what he's done. In week 1, he scored 26.7 points on 127 total yards, and then in week 9, he had 18.9 points on 109 total yards. And by the way, in week 1, he was the number 1 overall running back, and he actually left in the 4th quarter with his injury. Now, in week 9 against the Rams, where the Rams didn't have Matt Stafford, yeah, the Packers played with a lead here the entire time, so Aaron Jones was able to pick up 20 carries. This isn't always going to be the case for what seems like a bad Packers team. However, Jones is also probably the team's best wide receiver, and this was on display in week 9, as you can see right here on Fantasy Life, our official data partner. Look at this right here, where it says targets 21%. He earned 21% of the team's targets in week 9, which actually led the offense. Look, the Packers' best path to victories are Jordan Love throwing 30 or less times and Aaron Jones pushing towards 20 plus touches. That's how they've won 2 out of their 3 games this year. Now, despite the inefficient offense, Aaron Jones has done what Aaron Jones just does every single season, and that's be efficient. He's averaging 5.4 yards per touch so far this season. Now, heading into week 10, the Packers go on the road against the Pittsburgh Steelers. It's not an easy matchup for Aaron Jones. They're 3-point underdogs. They're probably not going to play with a big lead in this game, but that opens up the opportunity for maybe a 7-target game, a big game in the receiving department for Jones. And then when you start to approach the fantasy playoffs, and in the fantasy playoffs, Jones has some really solid matchups. As you can see right here, he'll take on the New York Giants' bottom 10 run defense right before the fantasy playoffs, and then in the fantasy playoffs, he faces the Panthers, who have arguably the worst run defense in the league, and if your team plays through all the way week 18, he's going to get a matchup against the Bears at home. So Aaron Jones is rising up the fantasy rankings now that he's healthy, and so is this next receiver. And that'll be the Commanders wide receiver Jahan Dotson, who we said, look, do not trade him after last week. We said he was a hold, and he continued his success into week 9. Because in week 9, he had another good game, 17 points on 8 targets. That was 20% of Sam Howell's targets in this game went to Jahan Dotson. He's starting to see more usage. And now more specifically, it's been these last 3 games where he's finding success. Here's what he's done during that time. You can see from my tweet here that I just posted on Twitter. You could follow me there as well for a bunch of more free content. He's averaging 17 fantasy points per game over the last 3 weeks, 8.3 targets per game, and 21% of the team's targets is a team high, more than Terry McLaurin. Dotson is taking full advantage of the success that Sam Howell has been finding the last couple of weeks and this Commander's number 1 pass rate offense. His quarterback, Sam Howell, right now ranks number 1 in pass attempts this season. His 39.2 per game is the most out of any quarterback in NFL history through the first 9 weeks of the season. He's on pace to break Tom Brady's record by about 50 attempts. And when you're throwing the ball a lot, your talented playmakers are going to see a lot more targets. That's what's happening with McLaurin, Curtis Samuel at times, and now Jahan Dotson. So you are finally getting the breakout player that you drafted this summer in Jahan Dotson the past 3 weeks. And I think it's only going to continue because the protection is getting better for Sam Howell, and Howell himself has become more efficient. And this is all happening at the perfect time for you as the fantasy playoffs approach. In these next 2 weeks, really good matchups against the Seahawks, which is a beatable matchup, and then at home against the Giants' bottom 5 secondary. So if you can, before the trade deadline, I'd be trying to acquire Jahan Dotson. It's going to cost a little bit more, but make sure you get a good deal done that improves your team. Now, another player that's been improving people's teams who have him is Jake Ferguson, because he is now a legit stud option at the tight end position for fantasy. According to Fantasy Life, our official data partner, in week 9, we saw Jake Ferguson have 23% of the Cowboys' targets, and this led to season high usage. Ferguson saw 10 targets in this game, and for the 7th straight week, his usage has increased. He ran 89% of the routes in this past game. That's elite. And he also played more of his snaps out of the slot. That combination of a high routes number and slot usage is usually the makings of a borderline top 5 tight end for fantasy. And the final piece to the puzzle is the red zone usage. He ranks 2nd in red zone targets this year, but he wasn't scoring touchdowns. But these last 2 weeks, they've been coming. The luck has been going his way. It's balancing out. He has a touchdown in each of the past 2 games. So Ferguson now has 5 top 10 finishes at the position. That's really good. And since the bye week, his role has expanded even more. His bye was in week 7. So in week 8 and week 9, he's ran 87% of the routes and earned 18% of the Cowboys' targets. For tight ends, this is great. He's a starter every week for you. And you do not want to try and trade him away or sell high because his schedule is elite. Because really, for the rest of the season, Ferguson only has good matchups. You get the Giants at home. home. That's a beatable secondary. The Panthers, one of the worst secondaries in the league. The Commanders give up the most points to opposing wide receivers and tight ends. Seahawks, beatable secondary at home. The Eagles, who give up a top 3 points to opposing wide receivers and tight ends. And then the Bills, which if you've been watching the Bills lately, yeah, the first 3 weeks of the season they were good, and now they've dealt with a lot of injuries, and they're one of the worst defenses in the league. So take advantage of Ferguson's matchups that are coming up and his improved usage. And also go ahead and get this next RB, but before we get there, 65% of people who watch these videos aren't subscribed. Just double check, make sure that you are. We're pushing towards 100,000 subscribers. That helps me, but also allows you to see my future content. Now that player I was hinting out is Rashad White, who, look, this guy has been proving me wrong, but let's discuss. I liked Rashad White this summer. We liked him because there was no competition and he was a good pass catcher, and that's the exact role we're currently getting from him. White right now ranks 2nd in RB receiving yards and receptions, so there's your pass catching, and he actually currently ranks 5th right now in snap share, so that means there's no competition. He's seeing a lot of snaps. So this is the exact role I was expecting from this summer, and we're getting the production over the past month from him, but my concern was these last couple of weeks, we just weren't seeing any efficiency on the ground really for his entire career, because White is averaging just 3.3 yards per carry. That's 53rd amongst running backs this year. There's only 32 teams in the NFL. Normally you start to see another running back get involved on the ground because of this bad of efficiency. But what White has going for him is Tampa Bay doesn't even have any other running backs. They tried Keyshawn Vaughn. He's never been efficient. They tried the undrafted rookie in Sean Tucker. That didn't work out. Chase Edmonds is there, but he's mostly a pass catcher. So now, despite being inefficient on the ground, he's been productive overall the last month. And you can see on Fantasy Life right here, over these last 3 games, White has played 80% of the snaps. He's seen 67% of the rush attempts, and during this time, he's averaging nearly 6 targets per game. But that's not all, because he has 3 straight top 12 finishes, averaging 17.7 points per game during this time. So that's all fantastic for White, but he has his first real test this week against the Titans. He's going to be at home in basically a toss-up pick'em game, just a 1-point favorite. The Bucs are at home, but the Titans allow the fewest receptions to opposing RBs. So if Rashad White can get past this hurdle, we can consider him matchup proof for the rest of the season. And now another guy who's basically been matchup proof his entire career, and that continues this year now that he's finally healthy, is T. Higgins. I hope that you bought low on him the past month that we've been putting him in the trade videos, because now you're not going to be able to. Look, T. Higgins fantasy managers have been annoyed with him because he was banged up and then he returned on a limited basis and he didn't do anything, and then he went on the bye week. He wasn't productive for them in months. And that could be reflected right here. He gets hurt in week 4, he sits out week 5, week 6 he comes back and he's limited to just 56% of the snaps, obviously not doing anything, and then in week 7 it's his bye week, so he gets you 0 points because he's not playing, and everybody's like, okay, I don't want him. That was the time to trade for him. But after that week 7 bye, it's been evident these past 2 weeks that he's healthy, and so is Joe Burrow, and it's looking great for these guys. Because Higgins returned from the bye in week 8, he puts up 12 fantasy points without scoring a touchdown, just a nice game of about 70 yards. Okay, he's starting to look healthy. Then in week 9, it gets even better. His routes increased to 93%. He's getting his full-time rollback. He earns a team-high 23% of the targets and has a great game against a banged-up Buffalo Bills defense. And here is that game. He goes over 100 yards on 9 targets, and it seemed almost effortless for Joe Burrow and T. Higgins in this game. Again, they're both finally healthy. It produced a top 10 finish for T. Higgins, and I'm expecting this to only continue. And now here's the deal. If we take out the games that he was limited or left early with injury, Higgins has played in 5 healthy games this year and averaged 8.6 targets per game, ran 86% of the routes, and 13 fantasy points per game. But we have to add more context, because the 13 fantasy points per game are okay, but not great. But here's the thing. Joe Burrow was hurt for 3 of those games, and in week 1, Higgins had 0 points on 8 targets. Obviously, the 0 points isn't going to continue on 8 targets. It hasn't yet, and it probably won't again, and Joe Burrow is now healthy, so let's just look at the sample with Joe Burrow. And here's the sample with a healthy Burrow. We got the 12 fantasy point day without even scoring a touchdown. He was still somewhat limited, ran 80+% of the routes, but then he got his 90% of the routes in week 9 this past week and 19 fantasy points. I think you can start to expect these 15 points on average, that 2nd or 3rd round receiver that you got now that he's healthy. Burrow's healthy, and this offense is dialed in. And now this upcoming week, he has a nice home matchup. They're 7-point favorites against the Texans, who that Texans defense allowed Baker Mayfield to complete 70% of his passes against last week. T. Higgins and Bengals have a nice team total. Fire him up again. So it's probably too late to get T. Higgins, but it's not too late to get this next asset. And that would be the fantasy blueprint that over 4,000 people are currently using to win their matchup this week, push towards the playoffs, and take home a fantasy championship. This is what you get every single day of the week. These are different tools, waiver wire tiers, rest of season rankings, game-by-game matchup notes, projections, and rankings for that specific week. Everything you need to schmack around your buddies. And the blueprint is extremely simple to acquire. You just scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description below and follow the 2 simple steps. And now here's a previous week's example of the game-by-game matchup notes filtered by wide receivers. You get every single fantasy relevant receiver, what they've done recently, their recent usage, where they're seeing their targets, and then the matchup against the cornerbacks, the overall secondary, and how those cornerbacks have performed against similar receivers this season. This is just a small tidbit of what you get. And it's only available for a limited time. Only a couple of more days this year will I be offering the fantasy blueprint. So now now's the time to get it. And if you're debating if it's still worth it, trust me, it is, because here's the deal. It's just $5 for the entire year. And if you end up not making your fantasy playoffs for whatever reason, I just refund that $5. You get all of this tools and access that 4,000 other people are using to make their fantasy playoffs and win the championship risk-free. So to get access today, just scan the QR code on the screen or click that link in the description below. All right, now let's talk about the Bills tight end Dalton Kade, because the rookie has fully emerged for Buffalo. And look, this shouldn't be too shocking because they spent a first-round pick on him. He was a great receiving tight end in college. This was the role he was supposed to get, but he just started the season slow. However, the last 3 games Kade has been producing. In the last 2 of those games, there was no Dawson, his other tight end competition. Here's what he's done. These last 3 games, since he's seen more usage, 82% of the routes and 24% of the targets, averaging over 16 fantasy points during this time. That makes him a top 5 tight end during that stretch, and he's actually been even better at getting open without Dawson on the field because there's different formations. 3 wide receiver sets are making it easier for Kade to get open. And you can see that right here on Fantasy Life these last 2 weeks, 18% of the targets, and then in week 9, his overall usage doesn't come off the field basically. 98% of the routes run, 32% of the targets. That's as elite Travis Kelce level usage as it gets. Simply put, in these new formations with 3 wide receivers, Dalton Kincaid's working out of the slot more and just taking advantage of opposing linebackers, and Josh Allen recognizes that. Look, this is a guy who earned 8 targets per game last year in college, ran in the top 10% in terms of speed for tight ends at the combine of all time. We know that he can get open. But this is an interesting time of the year because do you want to try and sell high on Kade? Now, if you feel good about your roster, don't do it, but there's a chance that Dawson comes back in 2 weeks and they kind of shift the offense back to what it was. So there's an opportunity to sell high, but only if you get a guy like Kyren Williams or Terry McLaurin, in my opinion. Otherwise, you have to hold on to Dalton Kade because yes, he's producing and looks great, kind of on that Sam Laporta right now rookie tight end trajectory. Now, another guy who looks great and just continues to earn targets is Deontay Johnson. This past week, he finally did it. Since 2021, he hadn't scored a touchdown, but then in week 9 against the Titans' poor secondary, he did. He gets 9 more targets, 90 more receiving yards on Thursday Night Football, 20 plus more fantasy points. This guy is just money. And now in the 3 games since he returned from injury, starting in week 7 through week 9, he has now ran 93% of the Steelers' routes and earned an elite 31% of the targets, meaning he has seen top 5 wide receiver usage during this stretch. Now, it's likely that your league mates know he's been solid. They saw him on Thursday Night Football maybe, but they probably don't think that he's been top 5 wide receiver solid, so maybe you could still send a trade offer for him. Because it's just vintage Deontay still now that he's healthy. He's a top 12 wide receiver upside every week with 10 targets basically every week. And it also helps that this season he's been efficient. He's top 20 in wide receiver efficiency, and he currently ranks 12th at earning targets per route run. Elite. And his schedule only makes things more appealing for him. Because this upcoming week he'll have a nice matchup against the Packers, then he has a tough spot against the Browns, but then after that, everything is winnable. A winnable matchup against the Bengals, great matchups against the Cardinals, Patriots, and Colts, all bottom 10 secondaries. You scroll even more to the fantasy playoffs, you get that Colts matchup, you get the Bengals again, and then you get the Seahawks. None of these matchups outside of the Browns a week from this week is going to be in the top half of the league in secondary play. So expect Deontay to be easily a top 24 wide receiver the rest of the season. I won't be shocked if he finishes in the top 10. Now, we talked about Joe Burrow earlier when we mentioned T. Higgins. Well, Joe Burrow being healthy has looked great, and he goes from being somebody that a lot of people didn't want on their rosters a month ago to now probably a top 5 quarterback the rest of the year. Because these last 2 games, according to Fantasy Life, look at this. His completion percentage, 78% the last 2 weeks, averaging 8.3 yards per attempt. For an example, 7 yards per attempt is an NFL average. 8.3 would rank in the top 5 basically at the end of the year if he keeps this up. So Joe Burrow, now through his 2 starts that he's been healthy, is making his case for the MVP. And the MVP of the Browns this year has been Amari Cooper, who with Deshaun Watson back last week puts up 139 yards on just 5 targets. There's going to be weeks where he sees a lot more targets because the Browns aren't blowing out the Cardinals. So Amari Cooper is rising up the fantasy rankings as well. And the nice thing is we know he can win on the underneath as an elite route runner and do stuff after the catch, but this year he's seeing a lot more downfield usage. His average target distance, 15 yards downfield, is 6th in the NFL, and he's top 5 in deep targets. That will lead to a lot more explosive plays and upside. Now, speaking of explosive plays, more should be coming for this next receiver. And that's Devonta Smith, who's been up and down this season as A.J. Brown has been dominant, and we've been seeing Jalen Hurts continue to get goal line touchdowns, and DeAndre Swift has emerged. But Devonta Smith should see more usage now that Dallas Goedert's hurt. And based on how good A.J. Brown has been, it almost seems like Devonta Smith is not even doing anything. But he's still seeing, as you can see right here, over 7 targets per game. That's top 24 wide receiver usage right now this season, and this should only increase without Dallas Goedert out there. So these are the players who are skyrocketing up the rankings before week 10 and for the rest of the season. All these guys are eligible for you to trade for, but if you want to see the exact players who are the best trade targets before the trade deadline, well, check out this video right here. And if you are one of the 65% of people who is not subscribed, if you made it to the end, you had to enjoy the video, just double check that you hit that subscribe button. It takes 2 seconds of your time and helps me out a ton.